Okay, we've been talking about the four cardinal virtues in the last few videos. We've mentioned temperance, courage, and the other two are justice and prudence, but let's take prudence in this video, or phronesis is the Greek word. And what Aristotle means by prudence is so important to understanding his ethical philosophy. It is, in a certain sense, the key virtue, as it is the intellectual part of virtue. Okay? And it's impossible, Aristotle says, to have virtue without prudence or practical wisdom. Practical wisdom, prudence, phronesis, all these words mean the same thing, okay? But on the exam, I'll try to refer to it in English, that is, as either prudence or practical wisdom. And it's impossible to have virtue without having practical wisdom, without being wise about decision-making. Remember, we've talked about practical wisdom or prudence as wisdom about the very decisions you're making. One way of thinking about it, too, is prudence or practical wisdom is the virtue of appropriateness, okay? It's the virtue of appropriateness. You ever hear somebody say, that was inappropriate. That's inappropriate. What does that mean? It means it didn't fit the occasion, okay? And what prudence is and practical wisdom is a virtue of imagination. That is, it's the ability to recognize how your actions will be perceived and received. That is, how they will affect others. Not just that and what about the action will affect others, but how the action itself will be received. That is, I have the ability, if I'm prudent, to recognize the consequences of what I do. And in particular, how those actions will be felt emotionally by other people. That's partly the virtue of prudence. It's the ability to simply foresee consequences, particularly the consequences with regard to other people and other people's emotional life. And you'd be surprised how many people simply lack imagination. They don't understand how they're coming off, how they're being received. And Aristotle thinks we have a moral responsibility to be appropriate. We have a moral responsibility to have imagination, to understand how our actions will be received by other people. To understand that, just take a crude example. If somebody just lost a close relative, you don't, there's certain things you would say to that person and certain things you wouldn't say, to be compassionate and kind and to be sensitive to the other person. Another way of thinking of prudence is a kind of sensitivity to other people, okay? So that's the general sense of prudence and practical wisdom. But in particular, Aristotle thinks prudence contains two things. Practical wisdom or prudence contains two things. It contains good deliberation, or sometimes Aristotle calls this cleverness, good deliberation and cleverness, and it also contains virtue as the correct vision. In other words, what does he mean by this? He means prudence is two things. It is being good at figuring out how to get what you want. It's being good at figuring out the best means to a certain end. That itself is cleverness for Aristotle. If you know how, if you're smart, you have a kind of political sense, you know how your actions are being received, you know how to get what you want. You know the best course or the best path to take when there's all kind of options before you, and you know the best way to get from A to B. Okay? You know the best way to get there. Or I should say, you know the best way to get from A to C is B, or something like that. In other words, you know how to get what you want. That's the first point. Prudence contains cleverness, and cleverness knows how to get what it wants. If someone is clever, they know how to get what they want because they can foresee consequences. They know how reality is responding to them. Okay, but cleverness itself is not good enough to be prudent or to be virtuous. Someone can be clever and be a complete narcissist. They can simply be very manipulative and know how to get what they want. They can manipulate people. It's very dangerous to have this kind of emotional intelligence or social intelligence, if you will, if that's not coupled with virtue. What does that mean? So it means very simply having the right end in mind. That is, having the good life as the end, having goodness, truth, the other people's goodness, having that as the end you're aiming at. If you're clever and you know the best route to goodness and to being a good person, then you're going to be practically wise. If anybody watches the TV show or watched the TV show House of Cards, someone like Frank Underwood would be someone who's very clever. He has very, very good political sense, but he's a horrible, evil person, right? That would be cleverness without virtue. In other words, it's not prudent. He's not a prudent person. He's merely a clever or a manipulative person, okay? And so what virtue does is keeps the correct vision in mind. Let's say someone is a hedonist, someone just likes physical pleasure, but they're also very clever. They're going to manipulate people and coax them into all kinds of manipulative positions, if that makes sense. They're going to manipulate people in all kinds of ways to satisfy themselves, or if they love money or whatever, right? The big key here is, do I know how to get what I want? Good, I'm clever. Is that tempered with virtue or the correct thing? Is it, in other words, do I want the correct thing? It's not just enough to know how to get what I want. I have to want the right thing. If I want the wrong thing, right, namely not the good, the bad, I have to want the good, and I have to be clever at knowing how to get what I want. That's prudence, okay?